100 years, we told ourselves a very tidy story about how civilization began. It went like this. For most of our history, humans were wandering hunter-gatherers, poor and restless, always chasing the next meal. Then, about 10,000 years ago, someone discovered farming. And farming changed everything. With farming came surplus food, and with surplus came villages, then towns, then cities, then temples, kings, writing, and everything we call civilization. Farming first, in other words, and only then the settled, building, worshipping world. Scholars even gave the supposed turning point a grand name, the Neolithic Revolution, as if civilization had flipped on like a switch. It was clean. It was logical, and a string of discoveries over the last few decades has been quietly taking it apart. Because it turns out that people were settling down, building monuments, burying their dead with care, and even tending plants thousands of years before they became farmers. What follows are 6 discoveries that push the origin of civilization deeper into the past than almost anyone thought possible, and that are still rewriting the textbooks right now. Begin at the bottom of a lake, with a site so old it makes the pyramids look modern. On the shore of the Sea of Galilee in Israel lies a place called Ohalo II. It is not a temple or a city. It was a small camp of brush huts built by hunter-gatherers around 23,000 years ago. That is not a typo. 23,000 years, more than twice as old as the supposed birth of farming, from a time when much of the northern world was still buried under Ice Age glaciers. What makes Ohalo so extraordinary is not its age alone, but how it survived. Not long after it was abandoned, the lake rose and swallowed it, sealing the camp under water and mud, where the lack of oxygen preserved things that almost never last. Archaeologists found the charred floors of the huts, a human grave, tens of thousands of plant remains, and the tools used to process them. And among those plants was something that should not have been there yet. Evidence that these people were gathering wild cereals, grinding them into flour on a stone, and possibly even cultivating them, planting and tending them, more than 11,000 years before farming was supposed to begin. The site was found by accident in 1989, when a drought dropped the level of the Sea of Galilee and exposed the ancient camp for the first time in thousands of years. What emerged was a snapshot of daily life almost too intimate to believe. The remains of 6 brush huts, hearths where fires had burned. And on the floor of one hut, the oldest known evidence of a made bed, a layer of grass bedding neatly arranged around the fire. These people fished, hunted gazelle, and gathered a staggering variety of plants, well over 100 species. And the sheer sophistication of their diet quietly contradicts the idea that pre-farming humans were barely scraping by. The first steps toward agriculture were being taken by Ice Age foragers, in a world we imagined was empty and simple. The second discovery is not a single site, but an entire people, the ones who took the next great step. They are called the Natufians, and they lived across the lands of the eastern Mediterranean between roughly 15,000 and 11,500 years ago. And the Natufians did something that, according to the old story, they were not supposed to be able to do. They stopped wandering. Before they farmed anything, before they domesticated a single crop, they settled down. They built round houses with stone foundations. They lived in the same villages for generations. They were sedentary hunter-gatherers, and their very existence breaks the rule that says you must farm before you can settle. And they were not just surviving in those villages. They were living rich cultural lives. Natufian sites are full of carved stone and bone art, of beads and ornaments, of grinding stones for wild grain. They buried their dead deliberately, sometimes with jewelry, sometimes with striking care. At one site, archaeologists found the grave of a woman laid to rest with dozens of tortoise shells and parts of a wild boar, a leopard, an eagle, and a human foot, in what many believe is the burial of a shaman. It is one of the oldest ritual burials of its kind ever found. There is even evidence that the Natufians held great feasts. There is another detail from the Natufian world that lands even closer to home. At one of their sites, archaeologists uncovered the grave of an elderly person buried cradling a puppy. One of the earliest signs anywhere of the bond between humans and dogs. And their tools tell their own story. Natufian sickles, made of flint blades set in bone handles, carry a distinctive polish along their edges, the sheen left by cutting wild cereal stalks again and again, season after season. They were harvesting grain on a serious scale long before they were planting it. Then, near the end of their time, the climate lurched into a cold, dry spell known as the Younger Dryas. Many researchers think it was this squeeze on their wild food, more than any sudden invention, that finally tipped their descendants into deliberate farming. These were not simple people waiting for farming to civilize them. They were already building a settled, symbolic, spiritual world with their own hands. The third discovery is the one that truly shattered the old picture. A place that had no business existing at all. On a windswept hilltop in southeastern Turkey stands Gobekli Tepe. Rising out of the ground are great rings of massive T-shaped stone pillars, some of them 5 meters tall and weighing many tons, carved with images of foxes, snakes, scorpions, vultures, and wild boar. It is monumental architecture, a place clearly built for gathering and for ritual. And it was raised around 11,500 years ago, which makes it thousands of years older than Stonehenge, and older than the invention of writing, the wheel, or pottery. Here is why it broke the rules. To quarry, carve, move, and raise stones like these takes many people, working together, organized, and fed. The old story said that kind of organized effort was only possible after farming created surplus and settled society. But when Gobekli Tepe was built, there was no farming here. The people who created it were hunter-gatherers. The discovery forced archaeologists to consider a startling possibility that it was not farming that gave birth to religion and monuments, but perhaps the other way around. Perhaps the need to gather in great numbers, to build and to worship together, was one of the forces that pushed people towards settling down and farming in the first place. There is one more twist at Gobekli Tepe that deepens the mystery. Those great T-shaped pillars are not just abstract slabs. Many of them have arms carved down their sides, hands meeting at the front, and belts and loincloths around the middle. They are not pillars pretending to be nothing. They are stone beings, towering figures standing in a ring, facing one another and whoever gathered between them. And then, most strangely of all, the builders eventually buried the whole thing on purpose, deliberately backfilling the enclosures with rubble, which is a large part of why it survived so well. The German archaeologist who spent years uncovering it, Klaus Schmidt, summed up the challenge to the old story in a single famous line: that first came the temple, and then the city. The temple, in a sense, may have come before the farm. The fourth discovery is the one happening right now, and it is turning Gobekli Tepe from a lonely miracle into the tip of something much bigger. For years, Gobekli Tepe seemed almost unique, a single genius site with no company. Then archaeologists started looking at the other hills nearby, and they found more. A whole cluster of related sites now grouped under a project called Tas Tepeler. The stone hills, scattered across the same ancient landscape. The most famous of them is Karahan Tepe. At Karahan Tepe, excavators have uncovered something even stranger than Gobekli. Chambers carved directly into the bedrock, rows of tall stone pillars, and a haunting group of carved human heads emerging from the rock walls, along with a giant carved snake. These were not one-off structures, but part of a connected world of monument-building foragers spread across the region 12,000 years ago. Gobekli Tepe was not a fluke. It was one voice in a chorus. One chamber at Karahan Tepe has become especially famous. Carved into the living rock is a room lined with tall pillars and set into one wall. A human head stares out across the space, as if watching over whatever ceremonies happen there. The whole complex feels intensely deliberate, staged, designed to move the people who entered it. And this is just one of around a dozen related sites that Turkish archaeologists have now identified across the region, formally launched as a major research project under the name of the Stone Hills. The work is ongoing, and each season seems to add another piece. What is emerging is not a single strange monument, but the outline of an entire lost chapter of the human story. An entire culture of hunter-gatherers, right at the end of the Ice Age, was building sacred stone architecture across southeastern Anatolia, and we are only now beginning to grasp how widespread and organized they really were. The fifth discovery takes us forward in time, to the moment those settled instincts finally exploded into something that looks like a true town. In central Turkey, around 9,000 years ago, thousands of people came together to live in a place we call Catalhoyuk. And it is one of the strangest early settlements ever found because it barely looks like a town at all. There were no streets. There were no obvious public squares or grand central temples. Instead, the houses were packed together wall to wall in a dense honeycomb of mud brick homes. To get around, people walked across the rooftops, and they entered their houses by climbing down a ladder through a hole in the roof. Inside, the walls were painted with murals and decorated with the horned skulls of wild cattle. And in a detail that connects them straight back to the Natufians, the people of Catalhoyuk buried their dead beneath the floors of their own homes, living quite literally on top of their ancestors. Here were thousands of people, sharing an urban life, long before the famous cities of Mesopotamia or Egypt. There is something else striking about Catalhoyuk. For a town of thousands, it shows almost no sign of kings, palaces, or rich rulers. The houses are remarkably similar to one another, as if this was a community of near equals, running their crowded world without an obvious elite on top. People plastered and repainted their walls over and over, kept the skulls of ancestors, and sometimes dug up the dead to plaster and paint their skulls before reburying them. After around 1,000 years, the town was gradually abandoned, its way of life fading out. It is one of the earliest glimpses we have of what it means for humans to live crowded together, and to invent more or less from scratch the messy art of living as neighbors. The sixth discovery is the one hiding inside a name almost everyone already knows, and it holds the oldest wall on Earth. The city of Jericho near the Jordan River has been continuously settled for an astonishing length of time, with the oldest layers reaching back around 11,000 years. And buried in those ancient layers is something remarkable. A massive stone wall encircling the early settlement, and set against it, a great circular stone tower, several meters high, with an internal staircase built roughly 10 to 11,000 years ago. Think about what that means. A tower and a wall of that scale, built at the very dawn of settled life by a community that was only beginning to farm. Archaeologists still argue about exactly what the tower was for, whether it was a defense, a flood barrier, a ritual marker, or a symbol of power and community. But whatever its purpose, it is monumental public building on a scale we did not expect so early. To raise it, the people of Jericho had to plan, organize, and labor together across generations. The very things the old story said could only come much later. Jericho has one more gift to offer, and it is a haunting one. In houses across the early town, archaeologists uncovered human skulls that had been carefully coated in plaster, with the features of a face modeled back onto the bone and shells set into the eye sockets. These plastered skulls of Jericho are among the oldest portraits of human beings ever made, most likely a way of keeping the dead present among the living, an ancestor cult at the very beginning of settled life. The same impulse we saw in the Natufian graves and beneath the floors of Catalhoyuk, to hold on to the dead and give them meaning, runs straight through Jericho too. The oldest wall in the world is a quiet announcement that ambition, cooperation, and grand construction are far older than civilization as we usually define it. So set the 6 of them side by side. Ice Age foragers grinding wild grain at a lakeside camp. A people who settled in villages before they ever planted a field. Hunter-gatherers raising carved stone temples on a hill. A whole hidden landscape of those temples across a region. A honeycomb town of thousands with no streets. And the oldest tower and wall on Earth, standing at the threshold of the settled world. None of these fits the neat old sequence of farming first, then everything else. And when you line them up, a very different story starts to come into focus. It seems that the deep human drives to gather, to build, to worship, to settle, to make art and bury our dead with meaning, did not wait politely for agriculture to arrive and give permission. Those drives came first. People were becoming what we would recognize as civilized in their behavior and their imagination long before they were farmers. And possibly the pull of those very drives, the desire to stay together at a sacred place, is part of what led them to farming in the end. The old model had cause and effect backwards. Farming may not have created the settled, symbolic human world. The settled, symbolic human world may have helped create farming. It also changes how we should picture the so-called agricultural revolution itself. The word revolution suggests a sudden switch. A single moment when clever humans invented farming and everything changed overnight. But these sites tell a slower, more human story. People gathered wild grain at Ohalo more than 20,000 years ago. They settled into villages as Natufians. They raised temples at Gobekli Tepe. And only gradually, over thousands of years, under the pressure of a shifting climate, did they drift from tending wild plants to fully domesticating them. There was no single inventor and no single day. Farming was less a lightning strike than a long, uneven slide, and the settled symbolic life we call civilization was already well underway before that slide was complete. This is why these discoveries matter far beyond archaeology. They tell us that the story of who we are is not a straight, tidy line from savage to civilized, unlocked by one clever invention. It is older, deeper, and stranger than that, full of hunter-gatherers who thought big, built big, and dreamed big while the glaciers were still melting. Every few years, another dig pushes the origin of the civilized mind a little further back, into a past we thought was empty. And the real question these sites leave us with is a humbling one. If people 12 and 20,000 years ago were already this ambitious, this organized, this spiritual, then how much of the true story of our beginnings is still out there? Still waiting under the soil for us to finally stop underestimating our ancestors and dig it up?